Let's bring in Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts, who is following the story. Stephen, the Canadian Prime Minister has been very vocal about his middle power strategy and agenda. What is Mark Carney likely to say in his speech to Parliament?
Look, we don't know for sure, but I imagine that he's going to echo many of the themes that he spoke to last night at the Lowy Institute and, of course, most famously at Davos in January, when the Canadian Prime Minister proclaimed that the old world order, the post-World War II order that had kept us all safe and secure for years, was now over. He said it was a rupture, and he said in the face of that disruption, it was up to middle powers like Australia and Canada, to name just two, to try and do what they can to constrain the activities of predatory superpowers. He made a similar point last night at the Lowy Institute. He never directly named the US and China, but it was very clear who he was talking about. There are only two countries that could be described as hegemons in the world, potentially, and that's America and China. So what he's really articulating here is that he wants Australia, Canada, European countries, South Korea, Japan, other democratic middle powers to band together to try and tip the scales, to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. His fear is that individual countries, if they just go up to Washington or Beijing by themselves, they're negotiating from a position of weakness, which means as both countries become increasingly aggressive and willing to use their power to try and get things their way, middle powers are at a severe disadvantage. So it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say to Parliament. It's one thing to say it in Davos, it's another thing to say it in the home of Australia's Parliament. Australia is absolutely one of the middle powers that Mark Carney is trying to energise here. I think we will see a lot of continuity in this speech, but it'll be interesting to see.
As we can see, these pictures over at the moment is the House of Representatives as the MPs assemble to receive the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The last time that a Canadian Prime Minister has addressed the Parliament is almost 2 decades. Very different times between then and now.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Mark Carney perhaps reflect on that. When Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister, addressed Parliament back in the dying days of the Howard era, it was a very different strategic moment. The world, of course, was grappling with its own challenges at that point, including serious financial challenges. But what we saw through the global financial crisis, of course, was countries coming together and working together, including through multilateral institutions, to try and contain the damage and bring things back to order. Now, that world has absolutely disappeared. If you told people in 2007 where we are now with threats of annexation of Canada from Donald Trump, they would probably have fallen off their chairs. So we are in a different strategic universe now. The rupture that Mark Carney describes is a profound one. And it's fascinating to see countries like Canada and Australia grapple with this and try and sketch a new path forward.
We are standing by. As you can see, the parliamentarians are on their feet to receive the Canadian Prime Minister. But this trip follows a 4-day trip to India where the Prime Minister there signed deals worth billions of dollars in significant diplomatic breakthroughs in Delhi. Are we expected to see similar business types of deals struck here?
Yeah, we will. We've already seen a few agreements unveiled. I don't think we'll see anything of the magnitude that Mark Carney has perhaps looked at in larger countries, but I think we'll nonetheless see some really concrete and potentially relatively significant agreements unveiled over the next few hours. The government's already basically said it expects to sign agreements in areas like critical minerals. We've seen some agreements on superannuation. We've also heard from the Canadian side that there may well be agreements on vaccines as well. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what's there. But of course, doing this in Australia is much easier for Mark Carney than it is in India. India and Canada have had a really fraught relationship. With Canada and Australia, it's much more straightforward. I mean, this is, in a way, the irony that you're looking at here. For many, many decades, Canada and Australia didn't have to pour a huge amount of effort into the bilateral relationship simply because it was so easy and because the stakes were relatively low. When you're living in the unipolar moment with a benign hegemon or a relatively benign hegemon to your south, in Canada's case, you don't need to worry too much about other middle powers or a friendly nation like Australia. But that's, of course, all changed now. We see Milton Dick here, of course, the Speaker now walking into the lower house ahead of the Canadian Prime Minister. But yeah, look, that is now all changed, and that's one of the reasons why Mark Carney is making the trip here to Australia to revivify the relationship and look for new opportunities. The world is a less friendly place. He needs new friends and partners, or old ones like Australia, to step up.
And we have shared steady cooperation on security, diplomacy and trade over the years as well. So you mentioned that is a relationship that, I mean, it dates back more than a century. We are standing by to hear from the Canadian Prime Minister here, who is addressing, or will be in moments, addressing the House of Representatives, after which there is scheduled a midday joint press conference in the courtyard with the Prime Minister of Australia as well, I believe, who'll be joining the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. Later this afternoon, Mark Carney will travel to Government House and then this evening enjoy a private dinner at the Lodge. Those are the schedule, but it's probably time, would you say, Stephen, to dip in to listen to the address that we are about to receive from the Canadian Prime Minister.
President of the Senate and honourable senators, to the sitting of the House of Representatives to hear the address by the Right Honourable Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada. Sergeant-at-Arms, please escort our guest to the chamber.
Stephen, while we are waiting for the Canadian Prime Minister to enter the chamber here, can you talk us through the protocol that is usually associated with a visiting Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, these are very carefully choreographed events, as you can imagine. We can see Mark Carney now making his way down to the government front benches, shaking hands with the Prime Minister, and briefly shaking hands with the Speaker too. It's worth noting, this is not a totally unprecedented event. You know, we do hear from leaders every so often, and it's also worth noting. Oh, we're hearing now.
House of Representatives, your address today is a significant occasion in the history of this House. We give the call to the Honourable the Prime Minister.
Well, my friend, Prime Minister Carney, and Madame Fox Carney, it is my great honour and an absolute pleasure to welcome you and all the members of your delegation to our Parliament on behalf of the people of Australia. And I know that I speak for every member of this place when I say we are very much looking forward to your address. It may help you to know that back in 1839, Britain sentenced 58 French Canadians involved in the rebellion in Quebec to be transported to New South Wales and put to work widening Parramatta Road, which goes through my local electorate in Sydney, and past Canada Bay in the electorate of the member for Reid. In 1854, it was a Canadian, Henry Ross, who stood in the centre of the Eureka Stockade at Ballarat and raised a new flag, the iconic Southern Cross, a symbol of the miners' struggle for justice. In other words, Prime Minister, Canadian rebels with bold ideas have always been welcome here in Australia. Always a context. That is because our countries have always recognised something of ourselves in each other. We are two societies enriched by Indigenous cultures and their love and connection to the beauty of our lands and our waters. Commonwealth countries that have forged unique, proud and independent identities. Democracies that did not just adopt the Westminster system, we made it fairer, stronger and our own. Two nations that are at our very best when we look over our wide horizons, when we look out to the world and bring our values with us as we engage with it. The first Australian Prime Minister to address a joint sitting of the Canadian Parliament was our great wartime Labor leader John Curtin, standing in your House of Commons on the 1st of June 1944, just 5 days before Australians would help Canadians take and hold Juno Beach. Curtin looked to the future those brave men were fighting for, how to secure a lasting peace worth the winning, how to build an economy and society worthy of the service, sacrifice and suffering of those who had kept it free, and the role that Australia and Canada had to play in this. Curtin said this: "In a world where none of us is strong enough to stand alone, we shall discover how and by what means we can best stand with and for each other." More than 8 decades on, even in a new world order, that old test endures. Technology is changing the nature of conflict and heightening the risk and cost of escalation. And if ever nations such as ours had the luxury of imagining that distance alone kept us safe, those days are certainly gone. The same Iranian regime launching indiscriminate attacks on nations across the Middle East orchestrated anti-Semitic terrorist attacks on a synagogue and a small business here in Australia in 2024. For us, as two democracies in an age of polarisation, as two dynamic trading nations in a time of disrupted supply chains, and as two middle powers in an era of strategic competition, Australia and Canada must seek and create new ways to stand with and for each other. Prime Minister, for all the comfortable ties of old affection, what makes the friendship between Australia and Canada noteworthy is what we do not share. We do not share a border, a region, a hemisphere, or any market smaller than the global one. Yet this makes the connection between our countries more meaningful, not less, because our cooperation, our partnership, is a positive choice, not a necessity. When we work together, it is on the basis of our shared convictions, not mutual convenience. And when we do, when we stand in solidarity with the brave people of Ukraine, when we work together to seize the economic opportunities of clean energy, when we strengthen our defence industry cooperation, including through Australia's biggest ever defence export, the world-leading over-the-horizon radar technology, and when we face up to the urgent global challenge of climate change, because we know what it means for our unique environments, for our farmers and growers and producers, and for our firefighters, who for decades have travelled between our nations to help each other in the toughest of times, and now face the prospect of their fire seasons overlapping because of climate change. When we act together, we demonstrate to our citizens that government is not a passive institution. It is an instrument for positive change. And what's more, when we send a message to all those nations that look to us as equals, as peers, as neighbours and as leaders, that they too have a choice, agency and a part to play, because peace, security and prosperity are not the preserve of the great powers alone. They are our common cause and our collective responsibility. Prime Minister, Australia and Canada are middle powers in a world that is changing. We cannot change it back, but we can back ourselves, back our citizens and back each other. And your visit reflects our shared ambition for Australia and Canada to do more together at a deeper level, to build on our shared strengths, from our resources and critical minerals to defence technology, to the investing power of our superannuation and pension funds. Prime Minister, in this decade, where nearly every single challenge is indeed a global one, the distance between our two nations has never mattered less, and the closeness of our values has never mattered more. Together, let us seize the opportunities that the world holds for us. You are very welcome here in our Parliament today. I thank you for your ongoing friendship and our regular dialogue. You'll be welcome in Australia always. Yeah.
I invite the Leader of the Opposition to support the remarks of the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I commend Prime Minister Albanese for his warm welcome for our guest of honour and his wife, Diane. Mr Speaker, I have a confession. I knew our guest of honour long before he became the Prime Minister of Canada. It was 1991. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Cold War was all but over. In that atmosphere, two young, somewhat idealistic students met in an economics postgraduate course at Oxford. The bond was immediate. Both from provincial backgrounds, Alberta, famous for its cattle, southern New South Wales, famous for its sheep. Both from families who cherished the value of education. Both quietly cynical about the pompous Poms and the boisterous Yanks sauntering around Oxford. And despite our different politics today, we both shared a healthy distaste for Soviet sympathisers. There we were, a Canadian and Australians, regularly sitting next to each other in class, you sporting black eyes from ice hockey, me sporting bruises and cuts from rugby. But Mark's thesis was of great interest to the professors, whereas I wrote mine on the price of beer, of far greater interest to our student friends. Back then, I don't think either of us imagined a life like this in politics. One of life's great joys is seeing old friends do well. So it gives me immense joy to see Canada led by an old friend, a man of the highest calibre, utterly devoted to his country. Prime Minister Carney, with your presence here today, we celebrate a remarkable bilateral relationship. And while our eyes are on the horizon, we also take this moment to look behind us. Democracies are the gift of British inheritance. It was the pragmatic, enlightened and accommodating nature of British stewardship that nurtured within our colonies self-identity, self-government and ultimately sovereign nationhood. With your presence here today, we acknowledge Canada and Australia's mutual inheritance and two great constitutional monarchies. Australia was fortunate to look to the example of the Canadian Confederation as we forged our own federation. Our federation debates were robust. One of our founding fathers said, "We shall find the Canadian Constitution is about the best basis that we can select." Another founding father had a very different view, saying, "In no regard can we look upon the example of Canada as one to be imitated." But whether Australia's founding fathers praised or criticised the Canadian model, they learned from Canada and yearned for what Canadians had achieved. Prime Minister Carney, with your presence here today, we say with gratitude that Canada helped shape the Australian nation. We are two great democracies that have successfully woven together the Indigenous, colonial and migrant threads of our societies. Over the course of 125 years, our two nations have known a steadfast, stable and mutually supportive partnership in peacetime and in wartime, in good times and in tough times. As we've just heard, our two peoples have known a deep and abiding friendship. Our partnership and friendship are testimony to the many achievements over many generations in trade and in business, in sharing intelligence and sharing industriousness, in fighting our enemies and fighting bushfires. Since you've become Prime Minister of Canada, I've admired many of the decisions you've taken that are grounded in economic realism, removing the consumer carbon tax, getting immigration under control and ensuring it's conducive to social cohesion, and a deregulation agenda that supports business and industry. Your speech in Switzerland in January was a much-needed wake-up call for middle powers of the West. You said, Prime Minister Carney said, "We're at a turning point. We must indeed stop invoking rules-based international order as though it functions as advertised." I'd go further. The rules-based international order has been exposed as wishful thinking of a bygone and benign era, especially in these times when autocratic regimes act with impunity. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. In this brave new world, middle powers cannot simply build higher walls and retreat behind them. We must work together. We must act together, closer than ever, on defence, on secure supply chains and sovereign capabilities, on maintaining free trade. As you said, the strength of our values matter and the value of our strength matters. It's that moral clarity that must guide us and protect our way of life. Prime Minister Carney, on behalf of the Coalition and Federal Opposition, it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome you to the Australian Parliament. And from one old friend to another, it's great to see you, mate.
Prime Minister Carney, it gives me great pleasure to invite you to address the House of Representatives.
Prime Minister Albanese, thank you, and to Jody for this warm welcome and for this great honour. Leader of the Opposition, Taylor, thank you for reminding me of the importance of beer and competition. And in terms of deflating the palms, I would note, I would recall our meeting with Prime Minister Starmer, our trilateral at a time of great consequence, where it was around drinks, and Prime Minister Albanese brought 4 of Australia's finest tins, which just happened to bear his name. Mr. Speaker, President, honourable members and senators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this warm welcome to myself, my wife, my colleagues to Australia. Let me also thank the Australian firefighters who are here in this chamber today. They came to my home province of Alberta when we faced record wildfires last summer, as is all too common. But what is also common is that action, that heroism is just as Australian firefighters have done for Canadians over the years. And this is just one of the many testaments to the profound and practical friendship between our two nations. Friends, it is a distinct honor and privilege to address this Parliament, one of the world's great chambers of democracy, and a testament, as both previous speakers indicated, to our shared Commonwealth heritage. Allow me a few words in Canada's other official language. Le Canada et l'Australie sont de grands amis,
are great
et
friends
ce depuis longtemps.
and have been for a very long time.
La confiance
Trust
est le pilier
is
central
the
de
central
notre relation.
cornerstone of our
Lorsque le
relationship.
Canada et
When
l'Australie
Canada and
agissent de
Australia act in
concert,
unison,
nous
we
faisons
make
une grande
a big
différence.
difference.
Et en cette période
In
de
these
rupture,
times of
notre
rupture,
collaboration
our
est
collaboration
encore
is
plus
even
stratégique.
more strategic.
Nous pouvons
We can
chacun renforcer notre
Each
souveraineté
reinforce our
et ainsi
sovereignty, and in doing
produire
so,
des résultats
deliver
concrets pour nos
tangible
citoyens et
results for
citoyennes,
our citizens,
même
all of them,
que
as
pour
well as for
nos
our
économies.
economies.
Mr. Speaker, the last time a Canadian Prime Minister stood here, it was a different era with different challenges. 2007, the eve of the global financial crisis, a crisis through which Australia and Canada sailed. We sailed through that storm because of the soundness of our banks, the probity of our public finances, and the resourcefulness of our people. And while much has changed since then, these qualities endure. as does the friendship between our nations. Although we could not be further physically apart, Canada and Australia are strategic cousins. We may look to different skies, the North Star in our hemisphere, the Southern Cross in yours, but we have the same orientation. We share a common heritage, have developed a common perspective, and can build together a common future. Two sovereign nations, two proud democracies, the true North and the land down under, navigating with the same values. As the Prime Minister indicated, what makes our relationship rare is that it was not built by geography or by great power design. It was chosen repeatedly over centuries. In the mud of Flanders, on the shores of Normandy, in the hills of Korea and the valleys of Kandahar, Canadians and Australians have stood by each other when the hour was darkest and victory most in doubt. And we have done so because we believe that people everywhere deserve to live freely, to govern themselves and determine their own futures, and that these values are worth defending even at great cost. Together, we helped to build the post-war international system, to draft the UN Charter, and to create a global economic order that brought prosperity to our peoples. We helped write its rules from Basel to Brisbane. We were at the table when the G20 was formed, when the Trans-Pacific Partnership was negotiated, and when the standards governing trade, finance, and security were all set. Yes, that system was imperfect, but it functioned, keeping sea lanes open, resolving disputes, growing trade and investment, and narrowing the gaps between rich and poor across the world. With that global architecture now breaking down from consecutive crises, I've come to Australia at your invitation to reaffirm our alliance and to suggest where it can go next. Because it's my fundamental belief, as a result of optimism I've picked up from people from this great country, that from this rupture we can build something better, more prosperous, more resilient, and more just. It's often observed that we have much in common: the Westminster system, federalism, common law, the Crown. Yet the foundations of our relationship go much deeper. We intuitively understand how each other's systems work, how power is constrained, how our institutions function, and the values that underpin them. This is the product of decades, centuries of parallel development, common inheritance, and continuous exchange between our peoples. It's not something that can be replicated by a treaty or sustained by rhetoric. On this common foundation, we have built civic nations, societies held together not by blood or soil, not by a single faith or culture, but by something more demanding and durable: a shared commitment to live together, to accommodate our differences, and to pursue the common good. Canada's founding insight is that unity does not require uniformity, that we can share a country without conforming to a single identity, that our differences, honestly acknowledged and respectfully navigated, are a source of strength. Australia arrived at the same destination by its own path. Let us remember that Australia was the first nation in the world to give women the right to vote and to stand for Parliament. Your example has inspired the world ever since. And that act of democratic extension, choosing to widen the circle rather than guard its edges, is the fundamental instinct that drives our common civic nationalism. Our two nations were built by risk takers, by voyageurs, by drovers. adventurers, people whose families left everything behind to start again. They crossed oceans with uncertain prospects to bet on themselves and bet on each other. And that commitment to building something together rather than resting on something inherited, is bred in the bone of our national characters. Of course, we are both nations still in the making. The important work of
and
reconciliation
ABC viewers on ABC TV are leaving us. You can keep watching Mark Carney's speech over on the ABC News channel.
Opportunities, regardless of gender, race, sexual orientation, or starting point in their lives. This work is not the sign of weakness, rather the product of a confidence and honesty that acknowledges when we fall short and relentlessly strives to do better. Mr. Speaker, the institutional depth we share, our friendship forged by shared values and common battles, creates a trust that is also a strategic asset. It is a source of power. And the question today for middle powers like us is whether we establish the conventions and help write the new rules that will determine our security and prosperity, or let the hegemons dictate outcomes. In the new global environment, the ability to form effective coalitions is becoming a central strategic capability. Great powers can compel, but compulsion comes with costs, both reputational and financial. Middle powers can convene, but not everyone can. In the post-rupture world, the nations that are trusted and can work together will be quicker to the punch, more effective in their responses, and more proactive in shaping outcomes, and ultimately, those countries will be more secure and prosperous. Mr. Speaker, middle powers like Australia and Canada hold this rare convening power, because others know we mean what we say, and we will match our values with our actions. This has been earned by those before us throughout our history. And the question is now, what do we do with it? Canada is choosing to create a dense web of connections to build our resilience. We've adopted a new framework for engaging the world, variable geometry, creating different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests for those issues. This is not a retreat from multilateralism, it is its evolution. And to be clear, Canada's support for the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the multilateral system is, like Australia's, unwavering. But while we are committed to reforms of these institutions in order to better reflect today's world, we need coalitions now to address immediate challenges. And as those coalitions work, they will help demonstrate the power of multilateralism and reinvigorate it. The fact is, right now, many countries are concluding that they must develop greater strategic autonomy. And this impulse is understandable. When the rules no longer protect you, you must defend yourself. A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. But in the 21st century, the requirements for economic security and prosperity of our countries extend far beyond food, conventional energy, and defense, as important as these are. Today, sovereignty requires reliable access to space-based communications and storage, vaccines, semiconductors, payment systems, and capital. Because governments and businesses went for decades prioritizing efficiency over resilience. We've developed supply chains and trading relationships that create dependencies on the great powers, sometimes even individual corporations. All of these affecting essential elements of our sovereignty. And as that integration is weaponized, This creates fundamental vulnerabilities. In response, Canada's strategic imperative is to build sovereign capabilities in these critical sectors, at home and in coalition with trusted, reliable partners like Australia, to ensure that integration is never again the source of our subordination. And let me, in the spirit of the Leader of the Opposition, move from the theoretical to the practical. I'll give 5 examples of this variable geometry in practice. The first, Prime Minister, is in critical minerals. Canada and Australia are the world's 2 most reliable and like-minded mining giants. We are both committed to sustainability. We have each developed the most advanced extractive ecosystems, all the range from prospecting to engineering, logistics, and capital markets. We're blessed with abundance of foundational metals that power the batteries, the EVs, the smartphones, the AI systems of this century. Together, we produce 1/3 of global lithium, 1/3 of global uranium, 40% of iron ore. In fairness, that's largely you. But we'll take credit for it. And we have a combined war chest right now of $25 billion to fast-track global projects. Globally, we're 1 and 2 in the most attractive. We're 1 and 2 as the most attractive mining investment jurisdictions in the world. We are the world's critical mineral superpowers. Now, in the old world, and even to a degree today, the temptation would be to see each other as competitors. In the new world, we should, as Prime Minister Albanese has suggested, be strategic collaborators to boost investments, accelerate technological cooperation, enhance supply chain resilience, expand our domestic processing abilities, and to reinforce each of our strategic autonomy. Which is why earlier today we've signed a series of new agreements on critical minerals, including with respect to the G7 Critical Minerals Alliance, an alliance Prime Minister Albanese helped to launch in Kananaskis in June. This is the largest group of trusted democracies with critical minerals reserves in the world. The second area is in defense. Both our countries are building up our capabilities so the next generation of drones, surveillance aircraft, cyber, and artificial intelligence are created in Adelaide and Alberta. Canada has just announced our first ever defense industrial strategy. It will catalyze $500 billion of investment in our security and resilience over the course of the next decade. This creates enormous opportunities for cooperation between our countries. As the Prime Minister rightly referenced, we are already cooperating with Australia on your world-leading over-the-horizon radar, and we're actively exploring new opportunities to protect our vast territories together. Australia and Canada are core members of the Coalition of the Willing, which provides vital military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine in response to Russia's illegal, horrific war. Mr. Speaker, the outcome of this war is not in doubt, although its duration is still uncertain. And when peace comes, and it will come, the coalition, including Canada and Australia, will provide robust security guarantees to support a just and lasting peace in Ukraine and Europe. As we have seen in this war in Ukraine, satellite communications are now a fundamental requirement for security. A Canadian-based constellation of LEO satellites will launch next year, providing reliable and secure global communications. We're working with other like-minded partners who possess similar capabilities to build out a deep, resilient, sovereign system that we can all share and we can each control in our territories. Mr. Speaker, artificial intelligence is my third example. As AI begins to transform our economies and our lives, strategic autonomy will require sovereign intelligence infrastructure, including secure clouds, data, LLM models, enterprise applications. Canada can contribute here as well, in partnership. We're the #1 global destination for master's and doctoral students. We produce some of the world's most renowned AI developers and are home to the leading AI institutes and many of the startups. But we know that is not sufficient. We know we must work with others who share our values to build sovereign AI capabilities so we are not caught between the hyperscalers and the hegemons. We're partnering with like-minded nations in Europe, and we look forward to today's agreements to work more closely in partnership with Australia, and as well, building on the announcement at the APEC summit in our trilateral AI initiative with India. Fourth, on trade. Our two nations are championing efforts to build a bridge between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union. Canada is already a member of both trading blocs. I hope soon you will be as well. Both of us know that the value of this is a global public good. Yes, it's market access, but it's a global public good because this is a bloc of 1.5 billion people grounded in common standards, shared values, and is capable of anchoring a new rules-based trading system even as the old one falters. To be clear, this is an ad hoc coalition, variable geometry, of middle powers that has a larger GDP than the United States, 3 times the trade flow of China, the largest combined financial balance sheets in the world, over 60 of the world's top universities, and the largest source of cultural exports globally. It might not surprise you, given my background, that my final example is capital. Over the past 2 decades, access to capital has become increasingly weaponized. And in the coming period of global volatility, our financial systems will likely be tested once again. Canada and Australia retain the advantages of sound banking systems, the most sophisticated and reliable financial infrastructure. We have the ability that others might think they have but don't. We have the ability to sustain openness to cross-border capital flows. Our pension funds and your supers constitute one of the largest pools, soon to be the largest pools of capital in the world, at present nearly $7 trillion under management. This is a strategic asset for our citizens and future generations, particularly in a riskier world where it will increasingly matter who owes whom and who owns what. The fact is, we are currently underinvested in each other's economies, and it's high time to modernize our bilateral tax and investment treaty, and I welcome today's agreement to do exactly that. Mr. Speaker, the connections, these new connections between Australia and Canada are greater than the sum of their parts. This is an alliance reaffirmed, a friendship strengthened, and a partnership to build greater prosperity and security in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. The fact is, Australia and Canada have never waited for others to write our futures. We've written it ourselves through a century of choices, standing together in the darkest hours, building the post-war order with optimism and purpose, and now helping to create what comes next. Yes, the world will always be driven by great powers, but it can also be shaped by middle powers that trust each other and act with speed and purpose. Australia and Canada have demonstrated that trust again this week. Every agreement signed, every coalition deepened, every commitment made is variable geometry in practice. And we do so because we both understand the scale of the task ahead and because we have traveled together on this road before. Canada could not have a better partner than Australia. And as one of my predecessors, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, said in the 70s, Australia is a self-possessed and confident nation that believes in the future of mankind. Two nations under different skies with the same orientation, a friendship built over a century that is ready to build the century that awaits. Thank you very much for this honor.
And that was the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney addressing the Australian Parliament, not done for almost 20 years by a Canadian leader. Let's get some analysis on what we just heard there. Stephen Jedgetts has been listening in from our Canberra studios and is with us now. Stephen, Mark Carney, very keen there to point out similarities in the bonds that Australia and Canada share, noting that although we're physically far apart, we are strategic cousins. He was really keen to highlight the strong foundation that the two countries already have.
Yeah, that's right. And Anthony Albanese was keen to make the same point. He said at the beginning, introducing Mark Carney, that the distance between the two countries has never mattered less, and that the fact that we have common values has never mattered more. And that was a very similar theme to the one that Mark Carney hit as well during that speech. Two words that he kept on coming back to there: trust and sovereignty. The main point that he's really making here, and he made this in Davos, he made it again last night at the Lowy Institute, is that sovereignty is under threat because you've now got a situation where the old order has disappeared. China is growing in power and strength, and the US is much less reliable. In that situation, it's much harder for middle powers like Australia because many of the systems that we rely on have essentially seen us give up our sovereignty. So if you look at clean energy, you look at artificial intelligence, you look at payment systems, you look across the whole invisible web of the systems that keep the global economy, including Australia's, humming, there are huge vulnerabilities there. Both Australia and Canada remain reliant in many ways on the hegemons. So what Mark Carney is really saying here is we need to actually find ways to build up our own sovereignty by building independent and sovereign systems in concert with other major powers. And that's where the second word comes in, trust. What Carney is saying here really is that what Australia and Canada have, along with other middle powers, is they have convening power because they are trusted by other countries and trusted by other middle powers in a way that China and the US simply are not. He said that great powers can compel, but that doesn't always have durability. Australia and Canada, he argues, actually have the capacity to build these new coalitions because they have trust, because they're trusted by other countries. Now, there are limitations to this vision, of course. No one is pretending, and I don't think Mark Carney is pretending, that you can live in a world that isn't heavily influenced and in some ways dominated by the great powers. But you can see the central point he's making. If middle powers band together, they have more leverage when they're dealing with the great powers, and he argues that's going to be critical in the very difficult years ahead.
Yeah, he characterised it as speaking about synergies rather than competitors, calling it strategic collaborators, how Australia and Canada can be exactly that. How that plays out, how that manifests. He spoke of deals with respect to critical minerals as well as defence.
Yeah, that's right. He went through a number of different areas where there's already cooperation, but where he argued that Australia and Canada could do much more. Critical minerals, defence, they were very much up the top of the list. But then he also spoke about artificial intelligence. Now, in all of these areas, of course, you know, Canada and Australia are very vulnerable to either hegemons, as he puts it, the US and China, or hyperscalers. In other words, massive Chinese and American entities, often companies that dominate the space. That's the case in AI. It's the case for payment systems. It's very much the case in clean technology. Now, all of this means that countries like Australia and Canada are not only going to have to work together with other middle powers, but also develop some of these critical technologies themselves. Of course, saying that is one thing, doing it is another. It's going to be immensely expensive. And Australia, in contrast to Canada, and there's an irony here, is not moving further away from the hegemons. We're actually moving much more close to the US at the same time through AUKUS. So whilst Canada is moving away from the US in defence space, spending less, or it hopes to spend less when it comes to its defence infrastructure, Australia is going in the other direction. But of course, that doesn't necessarily sit completely at odds with what Carney is saying. He says, look, it's going to be more opportunistic. We're not forming alliances. We're going to treat this on a case-by-case basis. At times, Canada and Australia and other middle powers will take different decisions and head in different directions. His broad point, though, is that collectively we exert far more power than we do individually, and it's going to be important for middle powers, where it's possible, to work together rather than just being picked off individually by the big players.
Finally, Stephen, it was a very warm welcome by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition as well, and the speech that was delivered was a non-antagonistic speech. It was one about very much so alignment, etc. But what do you see as the potential challenges to the relationship apart from what you just outlined there?
I don't think there are any profound challenges in the sense that there's an enormous amount of common ground. The difficulty will be when you bump up against some of the brute realities thrown up by the current world order, and in particular, perhaps by the Trump administration. So we got a bit of a hint of that overnight when Canada's Defence Minister said he was no longer really thinking, or that Canada was very unlikely to join the AUKUS agreement with Australia, the US and the UK. Now, that's because right now Canada is very keen to try and diversify its military alliances and its military relationships away from the US. So, you know, Australia, for its part, is facing a slightly different situation. Our great fear, or the Australian government's great fear, is not one of an overbearing US, it's one of an absent US. The great fear for Australia is that the US simply exits the entire Pacific region, leaving Australia vulnerable to an Asia absolutely dominated by Chinese economic and military power. So there are going to be differences here. Australia and Canada are not going to be identical, and there will be times, no doubt, you know, when we disagree. It's less about the challenges that actually face the bilateral relationship and whether middle powers like Australia and Canada can actually meaningfully band together on some of these really acute problems in a way that actually effectively constrains the behaviour of China and the US, or shapes those markets where the future is going to be written, whether that's in AI, satellite technology, green energy and the like. So it's a steep challenge, as both sides, both Australia and Canada, have acknowledged. It is not going to be an easy task. I guess Mark Carney's point is you can't shrink from this. You can't simply wish this away. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be expensive, but if we don't try and work together and actually build this new order in our own interests, then we're simply going to be on the table when the big players go to divvy up the prizes.